The next morning, Makoto gets ready to head to the forest for his herb-gathering quest, but Phil refuses to budge until they've had breakfast. Since they're out of meat, the two of them head to the forest together so Phil can hunt. Before leaving Makoto alone, Phil sets up a protective barrier around him to keep monsters away. Then Phil goes hunting while Makoto uses his assessment skill to quickly find the herbs he needs. With the herbs collected, Makoto hits up the online store for ground beef, pasta, and some sauces. He cooks it all up, and when Phil returns with another giant rock bird, he smells the pasta and rushes over to eat. Phil's never seen pasta before and is super curious, but the moment he tastes it, he's in love. Hearts practically pop out of his eyes. Afterward, it's time to head back to the Adventure Guild. Phil lets Makoto ride on his back, and they zoom through the forest so fast that Makoto's holding on for dear life. When they finally arrive, Makoto literally falls off Phil's back. Phil casually follows him into the guild as Makoto gets ready to turn in his quest. Makoto turns in the medicinal herbs he collected to the grumpy receptionist at the Adventure Guild. She gives him a measly amount of cash, and he's like, seriously? But then he learns that the guild also buys dead monsters. Makoto heads over to the guild's butcher and pulls out all the monsters Phil hunted from his magical toolbox. The butcher is floored when he sees the haul. It's worth a ton of money. The butcher even cuts off a chunk of monster meat for Makoto, telling him to enjoy dinner and come back tomorrow to collect his share of the profits from selling the rest. Makoto takes the meat and heads back to their spot for the night. At their camp, Makoto gets creative in the kitchen again. He grabs eggs and spices from his toolbox, slices the meat into steaks, coats them in egg, spices, and flour, then fries them up into crispy goodness. To stretch the meal, he even tops the steaks with leftover ground meat from lunch. Phil is loving every bite. The next day, Makoto visits the butcher again and is blown away by how much monster meat they've sold. He stores the rest of the meat in his toolbox, and the butcher hands him some magic stones they found inside the monsters. Apparently, these stones are crazy valuable. Makoto decides it's time to leave this kingdom and explore new places. Phil's totally cool with it. His only concern is getting fed, so as long as there's food, he's good. That night, they camp in the forest. With their newfound wealth, Makoto treats Phil to premium meals from the online store, ordering the fanciest meats available. Phil's blown away by the flavor and feels like his energy levels have skyrocketed. Curious, Makoto uses his assessment skill and discovers Phil's power has increased by 50%. Inspired, Phil decides to go hunting for even stronger monsters. Before leaving, he sets up a protective barrier around Makoto and bolts into the forest. In the forest, Phil goes on a rampage, taking down one powerful monster after another. First, he claws through the King of Aurochs in a single strike, then moves on to a bizarre lion-snake hybrid. Finally, he climbs a mountain and takes down a massive, lightning-charged deer monster. The fight ends with a literal explosion that shakes the forest. Makoto wakes up in a panic, freaked out by the noise and the pile of monsters Phil brings back. Seeing the sheer destruction, Makoto decides to never feed Phil that premium meat again. The next morning, Makoto cooks up one of the monsters Phil hunted, a giant snake. He fries it with lemon, giving it a crispy texture that even surprises Phil. Despite the weirdness of eating snake, the flavor is top-notch. During breakfast, Makoto notices Phil's hunting skills are insanely precise and magical. Inspired, Makoto tries to practice his own magic but fails miserably. Phil teases him the entire time. After some trial and error, Makoto manages to cast a weak fireball spell. Seeing his struggle, Phil decides to train him. The training method? Phil grabs Makoto in his teeth, runs through the forest, and dumps him right in front of a goblin colony. Makoto freaks out, shaking in fear, but Phil howls and tosses him straight into the goblin camp. Chaos erupts. Goblins swarm. Makoto and his weak fireballs barely fend them off, but the sheer terror somehow boosts his magic power, letting him incinerate one of the goblins. The goblins regroup and attack again, but luckily, Makoto's barrier spell protects him. With his confidence growing, he unleashes a massive fireball, wiping out several goblins. Exhausted, Makoto collapses, leaving Phil to finish off the rest. At that time, he can't stand it anymore and goes to their range, with one ball of fire in his face frozen. The last thing is, at that time, how many of them will die? But the rest? He falls to the ground and is unable to move. The wolf does the rest. When Makoto wakes up, Phil is sitting beside him, looking smug. Furious, Makoto yells at Phil for throwing him into danger, but Phil just grins and shows him the Goblin King's corpse, which contains a valuable magic gem. Of course, Phil demands a big meal in return for the gift. Phil gifts Makoto the Goblin King's body but demands a fancy earth meal in return. Makoto refuses, saying they already have plenty of monster meat. Exhausted from the goblin fight, Makoto tries cooking but collapses. The next morning, he orders a non-meat meal from the online store. Phil loves it and happily finishes every bite. Phil isn't worried about his health. He's a legendary wolf, immune to sickness thanks to Nerner's protection spell. The next day, they arrive at Finnan Kingdom. The guards stop them. Wary of Phil's size, Makoto shows his Adventurer Guild ID, listing Phil as his legendary companion. The guards are shocked that a newbie adventurer has a rank of beast but let them in. Inside, Makoto realizes he can telepathically communicate with Phil, even reading his thoughts. The guards warn Makoto, if Phil causes any trouble, it's on Makoto and punishment is severe. Stunned by the city's size, Makoto decides to buy a map. He leaves Phil at a stable with some food and heads to the library. There, he finds a magic training book priced at 7 gold coins, expensive because paper is rare. He learns maps are banned from sale in the city. Makoto returns to Phil, who demands food again. Makoto cooks rice and meat from the online store, and they eat until full. The next morning, Makoto buys a map from an adventurer for 1 gold coin, only to discover it's a scam. The same map costs just a silver coin at the guild. Frustrated but determined, Makoto and Phil leave the city and head into the forest for their next adventure. But that's where this video ends. I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.